story of Horford begins more than 60 years ago, right at the start of 1955.
Right, class, what was happening in 1955? Winston Churchill was Prime Minister, miss. Well done.
The average house price was £2,000, miss.
The first McDonald's was opened.
And what about you? What was happening in 1955?
Rock Around the Clock was top of the charts, miss.
Well done, all of you.
At the beginning of 1955, a 29-year-old man called Douglas Garrett and his 24-year-old wife, Mary Ann, were looking for a building to turn into a new school. Douglas had been a teacher for 4 years and felt ready for a new challenge.
What made you want to start a school?
I thought I could run a really good school. Also, I'd been left a bit of money by an uncle, and I was rapidly using it up, and I needed to keep it to pay for the start of a school. So that's why I wanted to start it just then.
My first impressions were that it was a very large house, that it looked really rather sad and rather neglected, but also it was very big. It had quite a lot of space around it, and one could actually think it was possible to start a school in it.
But as soon as we went in through the door, we thought, gosh, this is a nice house. And it was the feeling of the house, really, that was so engaging.
Douglas and Mary Ann haven't moved far in 60 years. They now have a beautiful home behind the school. Back in 1955, this was a stable block, one of the many outbuildings surrounding the main house.
There was a pump house, a mushroom house, an apple house. Those are all now classrooms. And then there were greenhouses around at the back too. And then the other buildings were all the buildings which are now down at the bottom of the drive, which is where the kindergarten is now.
So, with plenty of space for expansion, Douglas and Mary Ann bought Hawford and set about starting a school. There were no regulations. All they had to do was recruit some pupils. By the end of March, they had 1 pupil signed up.
Mr. Garrett had just started up Horford Lodge, and he met my parents. My parents came over and saw this school, and I was signed up, very first pupil. So it was probably a big leap of faith for my parents. But Mr. Garrett is such a charming man, and they were so taken with the school when they saw it, they thought this was the right thing to do.
By the time the school opened in September 1955, Douglas had signed up 15 pupils. 2 of them, still friends 60 years later, were Johnny Goodwin and Andrew Beard.
How did you come into school?
The front door was not used. That was for Mr. and Mrs. Garrett, and they lived upstairs with their children. So that was their entrance. But we used to come in round the back, in through the courtyard, and we come down this corridor here into the 2 classes.
This one was for the younger ones and that one was for the older ones, I think.
Yeah.
We heard that you had a star system and houses, and we were just wondering if we could hear a bit about them.
When we started, being only 15 or so, there were only 2 houses. The Romans, who were red, and the Greeks that were blue. And after a time, when there were about 40 or 50, obviously having 2 houses wasn't, it was just too many. There wasn't enough competition, I suppose. So they decided to have 4 houses, and they added another 2. The Persians that were greenhouse and the Medes that were yellow.
Very quickly, Horford excelled at sport, despite the tiny number of pupils in the bumpy pitch. It was a constant fight to keep the grass down and the sheep out.
The sports field is where it is, where the top field is now. The top side, nearer to the school, there was an orchard, and we had sheep in the field to try to keep the grass down, because we hadn't got gang mowers or anything like that. So at one time in the autumn they got into the orchard, and the apples which had fallen off the trees, and then they got back out again into the field, and they all suffered from diarrhea. So the children playing football in the field got absolutely filthy.
Over the next few years, Horford's reputation grew, and so did its pupils' numbers. From 15 by the end of the first year to 47 by the end of the second. and 83 by the end of the third year. Horford needed some more facilities, so what better than to build a swimming pool?
The pool was actually the result of one determined parent, Mr. Harrison, calling the other parents to a meeting in 1959.
He gave each one a bit of paper and said, I want you to write down on this bit of paper how much you're prepared to give towards building a new swimming pool. So they all wrote down there what they thought were prepared to give and handed their slips in. And Mr. Harrison counted it up, and it was well over £1,000, which in those days, which is a very long time ago, it was enough to build the swimming pool. So we got it in one go.
Do you have any memories of the swimming pool and when it was being built?
Yes, I do. Very, very strong memories of that, because the most remarkable thing about that was that it was all dug by hand, and it was two fellows, and we watched it, and it went on over so many weeks.
And it was finally finished, and it had to be opened. And there was Mr. Garrard decided to open it, and he stripped off to his red Speedos and dived eloquently into the pool and said, I declare the pool open. And it's been there ever since.
Around this time, another remarkable young teacher arrived at Hawford. His name was Malcolm Darling, and as well as his normal teaching, he taught pottery in the basement, created most of the stage sets for the school plays, and built the cricket pavilion.
I wanted to build one because there was nothing there before. If you had a cricket match, all the team could do was sit on the grass outside. And cricket squares really ought to have a pavilion. I had help from about 3, 4, 5 boys at different times when they could do it. And it was opened by Don Kenyon. He was captain of Worcestershire, the county, and he came and formally opened it.
Malcolm Darling's building skills also ran to elaborate stage sets for school plays. One of the most memorable was the set for the Ghost Train.
During the play, the so-called ghost train is meant to come through. So we had windows and a lot of flashing lights where you could see something, compartments going past like that. And I had one boy who was building scenery with me. He came up with the bright idea that he would bring in some bee smokers, because he kept bees at his home on a farm. So he brought these things in, and when the train was just coming through, he put it to the keyhole and puffed smoke through under the door and one through the window. It was actually very realistic.
Food has always been at the heart of Hawford. Children used to sit in houses with their housemaster presiding over the table. In 1956, meals for the Christmas term cost just over £5. Mary Ann Garrard was responsible for the kitchen.
I've heard that meals at Horford were so good and that people sent their children to Horford just for the meals.
Oh, well, I hope they didn't send just for the meals, but I do think that our meals were quite good as school meals go, actually.
They were more than first class, they were supreme. In fact, boys used to go home in the evenings quite often and say, "Why, Mum, why can't you cook it like Mrs. Garrett cooks it?"
Right, class, today's lesson is on the history of Hawford in the 1960s. Now, what came first? Science or central heating?
Was it science? Because I think that came in the 1962 and central heating, if I'm right, came in 1965?
Well done. What other sport did Hawford excel at, other than football, rugby and cricket?
Shooting. They did have a very good shooting team, and they had a shooting range where kindergarten is now.
In 1968, what was Hawford Fishing Club's greatest achievement?
Was it catching 5 large pike in a pool by the canal?
Very well done. Class dismissed.
Of course, the canal didn't look like this then. You certainly couldn't canoe on it, but the school still made the most of it.
We used the canal for playing in, really. There was no partition between the school and the canal. Just the school ground went down to the canal. It was full of reeds and a good deal of detritus of all kinds. All sorts of old things had been there for years and years and years, long before we came there.
Did people ever venture down there?
There was a tunnel, well, a wide pipe under the main road to join the two bits of the canal up, because water flowed through all the time. And it wasn't until afterwards that I discovered that some of the boys had actually crawled through this pipe to the other side and then crawled back again.
The 70s were a very busy time at Hawford. There were several new buildings, including the Cobb. It was originally built as a covered play area with no walls, and named after Richard Cobb, a brilliant Horford teacher who very sadly died young.
The swimming pool got a heating system in 1973, and in 1977, Douglas Garrard bought the land which is now the lower sports field. Every year brought new activities such as chess club, carpentry, canoeing, poetry competitions, cycling, and the first ever Horford ski trip.
Fantastic staff came and went, and in 1982, Douglas and Mary Ann retired after 27 amazing years. And at about the same time, a small boy started at Hawford. Do you know who he was?
Our teacher then was Mr. Race. He took over from Mr. Garrard. So Mr. Garrard retired in the July, and I joined in the September. Mr. Race was a character. He was very similar to Mr. Turner in lots of ways. We at Hawford we did things differently to other schools. We were allowed probably more space and freedom than maybe other schools at the time.
In the mid-1980s, two important things happened. Building work started on Little Hawford. These were new classrooms for the younger children. About this time, the first girls were enrolled at the school, and two other familiar faces joined the teaching staff.
The changes have been huge, particularly in the structure of the buildings. I can remember the current changing rooms were changing rooms, but they were grim because they were like outdoor farm buildings. And I can remember one little boy coming and saying, knowing I was into wildlife, Mrs. Bradley, look what I found in my kit bag. And came to me, which he said, it's a baby mouse. It wasn't a baby mouse, it was a rat.
Kindergarten was originally in Mr. Percival's current classroom. That was opened about 22 years ago. Kindergarten, a very small class in Mr. Percival's current room. And then it moved to what is now Mrs. Riley's class, which was like a cucumber house. It was very, very hot because it was mostly glass. If you wanted to put displays on the wall, you needed to put trellis on the brick in order to put anything up on the wall because everything fell off.
In the early 1990s, the King's School became interested in buying Hawford. Negotiations rumbled on and on. It was an unsettling time for staff.
We understood that we were likely to be purchased by either the grammar school or King's School, and we didn't know which at the time. So the staff that were here were feeling very nervous about it because they were two very large schools about to take over a very small school, and we thought we could easily just disappear. And in fact, there was a long time when we felt that what would happen was King's would buy us and close Hawford altogether and just move the children into Worcester, in which case we'd all lose our jobs.
But as we now know, none of that happened. Hawford grew and thrived and kept its special character. Much has changed in 60 years. We've gone from 15 pupils in 1955 to 338 today. The number of teachers has risen from 2 to over 70, and those first two classrooms are now 2 of 30.
On a cold February day in 2015, we all filed out of our classrooms to watch Douglas Garrard cut the first sod for a new Hawford Hall. This will provide fantastic facilities for a new generation of Hawford pupils. An amazing new space for the next 60 years.
Since 1955, we've had 13 Prime Ministers.
McDonald's has built 36,000 restaurants and the average house price has risen by 250,000.
But we don't think much has changed here at Hawford.
In fact, this is what we think.
Horford is the best!